Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ALBA Party online hustings for the deputy leadership. Got with me tonight uh, Chris McElhenney, who's a deputy leadership candidate, and the other candidate, Neil Hanvey. The format of the debate is going to be opening statements from each candidate, which will last for approximately 4 minutes, and followed by questions and closing with 2-minute closing statements from each candidate. We're expecting this to last approximately 40 minutes or thereabouts. So, gentlemen, do you have any preference for who would like to start?
None at all, Mike.
None at all, Mike. By all means, Chris, go ahead.
Chris, are you happy with that?
Sure.
Okay, if you want to start with your 4-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for chairing this evening, and hello to any ALBA members that are watching, and indeed anyone who's not an ALBA member, because you're equally as important to us going forward in terms of how we build and succeed as a political party. And that is the reason I'm standing to be the deputy leader. I think I've got the best experience that the party needs to help us have a match-fit election-winning team to deliver on the success that we all know Alex Salmond wanted us to achieve at the next Scottish Parliament elections. I think there will be 3 key themes that make ALBA stand out at the next election. The first is, we know from 2026 and 2021 that the list system sees about 1 million votes that pro-independence voters cast lost. They don't deliver any seats for the independence movement. If ALBA can ensure that people and members across the independence movement know that a vote for ALBA Party is a vote to help the independence movement, I think then that could help us lead to 10, 12, even 15 or more seats in the Scottish Parliament, and that would all but ensure a pro-independence majority after the next election. But, you know, there are other parties that say they're pro-independence, so what makes us different? I think in the here and now, there is a rollback on some of the popular policies that the first Alex Salmond government introduced in 2007 onwards. Back then, people knew that if you voted SNP, you were voting to keep money in your pocket, and you were voting for a sensible way forward, such as policies like freezing the council tax. Across Scotland, people will be getting hammered on the 1st of April this year with bills in excess of 10, 12, even 15% as their council tax goes up, all at the same time that councillors have given themselves a 22% council tax, sorry, a 22% pay rise. Now, these are the sort of policies that people start asking themselves, what are you doing for me? So, of course, we're strong in independence, but we need to make sure we're putting money in people's pockets with policies such as our 5-point plan to tackle child and family poverty, a policy that I was really proud to have developed for the party. So independence and putting money in people's pockets is key. But as we see across the world, there is quite clearly a rejection of the woke agenda that would have us believe that men are entitled to enter the single-sex spaces of women. You know, I think that from the launch of ALBA Party, we have been very strong in this position. And the fact that we have the only woman, in fact, the only person ever to have resigned from government on a point of policy principle in Ash Regan, which was in opposition to Nicola Sturgeon's gender self-ID policy, I think we have a very strong case that people will listen to us when we say that if you vote for ALBA Party, you can be guaranteed that we will stand up for the rights of women and girls. So in this election, with a strong pitch on independence, a promise to put money in people's pockets, and the guarantee that we will stand up for the rights of women and girls, I think that's a very compelling case for why people should vote for ALBA Party. And those are the policies that, as Deputy Leader, I want to take out to the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Neil, would you like to go now?
Sure thing. Good evening, everyone, and thanks to all members who are joining us this evening, and to supporters across the political spectrum who are watching ALBA very closely because of our political position, not just on independence, but also on the rights of women, something that I have been a very vocal champion of for many years now. Of course, this is a competition that absolutely none of us wanted, because the loss of Alec was, just unbelievable. No one can replace Alec. But when I got the message that we had lost Alec, in amongst the sadness and anger that I felt as a result, I knew that it was my responsibility to give my full support to Kenny McCaskill, or indeed whoever was the acting leader, to ensure that they were able to discharge their duties and make sure that the party got through that very difficult time without taking any significant hit. And I know that was important because of my own leadership experience in the NHS. I know that things like honesty, integrity, tenacity, and transparency are absolutely essential to leadership. And also underpinning all of that is a strong sense of purpose and courage. And I have shown courage in my political life. You look at my track record. Back in 2019, I was the first person to reach out for Women Scotland, first politician, and I stood up to Nicola Sturgeon on her gender recognition reforms back in 2019. And then when I was an MP in Westminster, it was Kenny McCaskill and I who stood up against Boris Johnson's rebuff of Scotland's right to self-determination, making headlines across the globe. And when, with the case of self-determination undimmed, it was me that pursued not once but twice the Scotland Self-Determination Bill, which would amend the Scotland Act to give Scotland parity with Northern Ireland to resolve their constitutional position. And now that has been adopted by the Scottish First Minister as a position they are certainly interested in pursuing. So in terms of how the party has developed over the years since our inception, I think that those are three good examples of where our courageous position, our principled position, has cut through, and it has built on the more recent successes that we've had in our political campaigns. But there's one resource that we're not tapping into properly, and that's our membership. We know that we've got a skill set within our membership, and they are an invaluable resource to the party. And so my priority as Depute Leader is not to decide policy. That's a decision for conference. Conference will debate our policies and will set our policies, and I will argue my position within those debates. But it's to build the capacity within the party to deliver, because make no mistake, this contest, the 2026 election, is not just about the future of the ALBA Party. It's about protecting the very essence of the dream of independence. Now, the legacy media are not our friends. We know that they will run as many stories about us that will cause us damage, but they refuse to print positive stories about us. So we need to create our own narrative, our own message. And the best way to do that is to have a twin-track media approach where we continue to use the legacy media as and when, but we build our own story using social media, and we reinforce those important messages on the doorstep with good old traditional campaigning. We need to talk to the problems that Scotland faces: drug deaths, deprivation, the deindustrialisation and the closure of Grangemouth, and the continued robbery of our vast natural wealth. We need to give people hope again. We need to relight the fire that was there in 2014 during the independence campaign. And independence, whilst it's important, is only a gateway. We need to give people the vision and the dream of why that's important. And so it's our priority, must be our priority, to engage with that wider movement, to give them the hope and aspirations of the 2014 independence referendum, reframed for the modern era and reframed using new media instead of relying on legacy media. I think I've got the skills, ability and determination and I think drive and commitment for the party to be the best depute to whoever you elect as your leader. And I can give you a guarantee that I will do that with absolute determination. Thanks very much.
Neil, and the first question is on housing. The Scottish Government has recently declared a housing emergency in Scotland, and several local authorities have done the same. can I hear from each candidate what your views are on this housing crisis and how best to tackle it? And we'll start with Neil.
Thanks very much, Mike. Yeah, well, I mean, the housing crisis is very real. It's an issue that I dealt with day in, day out as an MP. The whole system is absolutely locked. There are people who have maximum points, maximum medical points, and every supplemental point you could imagine. But the councils simply do not have housing stock. It's not the fact that council officers are unwilling or unable to do their job. They simply don't have the stock to put people into. And so there's an urgent need to address that. Our current position as a party is a national house building company. I think that's got to be the priority. But we must build more council houses or indeed housing stock for housing associations. It's simply not good enough to call housing affordable when actually for the vast majority of people on minimum wage, it's completely unattainable. And so many young people who've been brought up in the belief that the only way to be successful is to buy your own home. And buying a house is completely out of reach. They've got so many cost pressures. And so there's an urgent need for people to have a normal life, to have a home life and build a family, that we need a considerable investment in new housing stock, and that must be a priority. But the fundamental thing, and something we must always link this to, many of these decisions in terms of the funding and resources that are put into such projects, the economic decisions to make to build new council housing, that only comes when you have all of the control of an independent country. And that's why independence is so important. These are not side issues. These are core reasons to vote for independence.
Thank you. And Chris, now would you like to address that question?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. No, I think there are various different aspects to this question. Housing isn't just council housing, it's also about owner-occupiers. The short answer is, why do we have a housing crisis in terms of local authorities' housing stock and housing associations? It's simply because not enough housing is getting built. And I think it's actually related to the cost of living crisis. We've seen massive inflation over the past 3-4 years. And actually one of the byproducts of that is we've seen massive increases in private wealth due to the interest rates, but also we've seen a massive increase in the size of pension pots. I'd quite like the government to be a bolder on this. We should have policies in place that, whether it's the Strathclyde pension scheme, whether it's the NHS pension scheme, they shouldn't be allowed to invest in companies that purchase and support the facilitation of the construction of weapons. I think that's quite a popular move, and we should be putting quotas and targets on them because they, of course, are member-led organisations. They should be forced to actually invest the billions of pounds that they have locked up in pension funds in building housing. And that then ties into how do you secure the capital for a national housing company. It doesn't have to just be annual revenue and an allocation from the Scottish Government's capital budget. There are massive pots of money out there that we all pay into through taxation, which go into pension pots, as I said, for councils, for hospitals, for the civil service. They should be forced to actually invest in housing. But I don't support the narrative that we should also pull the ladders up on people. I don't live in a council house. I live in a flat. I bought my flat. My mortgage will be paid off in something like 22 years. I don't want to have to pay rent for the rest of my life. And the vast majority of the aspirational voters that are listening to what ALBA are having to say are in that position as well. They want to own a house. Mortgages are far too expensive. Securing a deposit is far too expensive. That means they have to then go and pay something like, let's just say, £800 to rent a private property, whereas the equivalent home would be £350 in monthly mortgage fees. We have to let people like that know that we're listening to them. We're not just saying let's build more housing so that we can create more housing stock for local authorities or housing associations that are, quite frankly, anti-democratic. The whole point of investing in housing stock is so that we can have more affordable housing on the market. The more housing we have, the lower that'll decrease demand, and that'll stop the quite frankly crazy situation that when my mum and dad bought their first house, it was probably something like 3 times their salary, whereas today a first-time buyer trying to buy a house is faced with upwards of 10, if not 15 times their salary. We have to also address that, because that is a big group of people that in 2014 voted for independence. 10 years, 12 years on next year, they now have their own families. They're looking to get on in life. They're looking to aspire. They're looking to move into back and front doors. And quite simply, they don't exist. So yes, we need to build more housing. And I've explained how we do that for social tenants. But also, we need to make sure we have the environment in place in Scotland that developers can come in and build the family homes that people want to buy, so that in 25 years, they don't need to pay rent for the next 40, 50 years. That's the only downside of scrapping right to buy. You know, when you were able to buy your own council house, that was your house. As soon as you'd paid that house off, it was yours. We have people in Scotland that pay rent forever. That's a system that needs to be looked at. If you've paid rent for 70 years on a property, something's quite clearly went wrong. There has to be a middle ground between ensuring that there is enough stock for new people coming through, but at the same time, you don't disincentivise people from actually being a council tenant, because nobody wants to pay rent for the rest of their life to anyone. Okay.
Thank you, Chris. The next question concerns Trident. I'm sure you're both aware that Ian Blackford of SNP has recently said that we need to reappraise the position on Trident, whereby the independence movement has always felt that one of the benefits of independence is to get rid of Trident. But with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and with Donald Trump's apparent friendliness towards Putin, is now the time to get rid of Trident in Scotland, or should we be looking at that whole idea again?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, I wrote ALBA's policy on Trident on defence, and ALBA's policy is that Scotland would rid our shores, the Clyde, of nuclear weapons from day one of independence. I quite often heard people over the last few years say that that wasn't credible, particularly some of the people in the SNP that are now coming out and saying we should scrap unilateralism. But the reality is, if there is a vestment day of when Scotland's going to be an independent country, that's going to be circa 2 years in advance. It is very credible that Scotland can tell the UK government, as of this date, we are no longer going to allow you to process and arm Trident nuclear submarines on the Clyde. That's then up to them what they want to do. If they want to maintain a nuclear deterrent at the expense of hundreds of billions of pounds, if they want to invest hundreds of billions of pounds in new infrastructure in Portsmouth or in Wales or Northern Ireland, that's entirely up to them. But ALBA's position is that in an independent Scotland, we should have no nuclear weapons from day one. And it's not just the moral argument. You know, the independence movement was built on the strength of the anti-Trident movement over 60 or 70 years ago. But there's the economic argument. I worked out the maths once, so about £7 million a year is the contribution from Inverclyde to the renewal of Trident. You go to a bigger local authority like Glasgow, it's £40 million. So we hear that WASPy women can't be compensated. We hear that pensioners have to be frozen because they shouldn't have a winter fuel payment, something that ALBA Party is campaigning strongly on. We're hearing now that we're going to need to see welfare cuts, and we're hearing that we're going to see tax go up, all while we're spending over £205 billion over the next 30 years on a system that either will never be used, or if it is used, everything's irrelevant anyway because everyone dies. It's an abomination. It should go. Independence is the only pathway that Scotland will rid our shores of nuclear weapons. That's the ALBA Party policy. I'm proud of it, and I will die in a ditch before we as a party change it, and I'm sure 99.9% of our members share that view.
Neil, can we hear from you on this issue of Trident?
Yeah, well, look, you know, there's no moral or tactical argument for Trident or nuclear weapons. There's no economic argument. I mean, one of the arguments we hear is, well, what about all of the jobs that you'll lose at the base? Well, the simple answer to that is you convert it into a normal Navy base and you don't have weapons of mass destruction next to your largest population centre. So, I mean, none of the arguments stack up. But there's also a pernicious element to having WMDs on your doorstep. And, you know, working with Chris and others, you know, I surfaced many of the concerns about the safety of the current stockpile of nuclear arms as they both move around the UK and in and out of Scotland, and the safety of the vessels in the fleet. We also know that the test firings of the cruise missiles that the current subs are firing have failed. So the weapons themselves, the vessels themselves, are not fit for purpose. They are a threat in and of themselves. And when it comes to the idea that somehow having WMDs on the Clyde is a deterrent for Vladimir Putin. And that is a fallacy. What it is a target on Scotland for attack. And it's unacceptable, indefensible, and they must be removed day one of independence.
Thank you, Neil. Our next question concerns ferries, both the building of our ferries and the operation of our ferry on the Clyde and the West Coast routes by Caledonia and McBrain. The first part of the question is to ask if it's right that Scotland's ferries are being built in Turkey and not in Scotland. And the second part of the question relates to the problems of the CalMac struggling to provide ferry services with our ancient fleet of vessels. What do the candidates feel about these two issues that are, and what would they propose doing about that situation? Neil, do you want to take us away on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first point I would make is how badly let down island communities are by the current government and the fiasco over the management of ferries. The second point is that there was a very clear pathway to modern and efficient services using catamarans tabled way back at the beginning of all of this. And yet again, the tenured government decided not to listen to something that would have been easy to progress, would have been adaptable to the current harbours and ports that the ferries would have docked at, and could easily have been manufactured here. So they've built two ferries that are fueled by LPG. And there's no direct supply of LPG on the West Coast to supply these vessels. So, I mean, the whole situation has been an utter shambles. Kenny has looked into this in great detail, and one of the biggest problems is the fat salaries going into the lawyer class on CMAL. And it's just another example of the wrong people making the wrong decisions for the wrong reasons. There's absolutely no way that a country such as Scotland, with a proud history of shipbuilding, should be sending an order to any other country other than themselves. So the fact that the ships are being ordered in Turkey is an absolute outrage and a failure of government. So, I mean, in short, this has been an excruciatingly badly handled circumstance. It's given our opponents and the opponents of the independence movement a rod to beat the Scottish government with, and it was a completely unnecessary fiasco because there was a clear path right at the beginning that would have enabled us to have a new, modern, capable fleet at a much lesser cost than these ferries that have got the wrong engines in them.
Okay, thank you, Neil. And Chris, now can we hear from you on the issue of ferries?
Yeah, of course. Close to my heart. I served on the task force that saved Ferguson from closure in 2014. Back then, I thought that bringing the yard into public hands was the best way to save it. Alec phoned me and says, just park that argument for a moment because there's a buyer lined up, and lo and behold, Jim McCall came forward and bought the yard. And anyone that's visited Inverclyde could see the improvement in that yard. Literally, you could see it. New office accommodation, new sheds, new machinery. And I was really confident that there was, a 40-year pipeline of work on the back of Jim's vision for, building ferries there, taking ownership through the Scottish Government of the largest dry dock in the UK, Inch Green, which sits not far from it, which would mean you could build big ships. An interesting statistic is there are as many ships and boats sailing around the world today as there ever has been in history. And we're a maritime nation. So it's not just about building ferries, it's about building fishing ships, it's about building the cruise ships that come into the east of Scotland and the west of Scotland. Of course, it was a failed procurement, but ALBA policy is pretty clear on that. We think that CMAL and CalMac should be abolished and a new Ferries Scotland should be created. Ferries Scotland, which has board representation from islands communities and from workers that work in CalMac on the RMT. CMAL was created to be a one-man and a dog organisation to effectively bypass or, be compliant, probably would be a better phrase, with EU legislation. Scotland's no longer in the EU, regardless of what you think or not. The notion that the Clyde has to ask Turkish shipyards to build ferries for Scotland is, quite frankly, offensive. I tried to take legal action against it at the time because the Scottish Government has clear legal guidelines that procurement contracts over a certain value must have a community benefit. I was told the community benefit was that an apprentice a year would go to Turkey for work experience for 2 weeks. Now, the whole point of public sector procurement, so in this case, £300 or £400 million worth of procurement sent to Turkey. If that £300 or £400 million was spent on the Clyde, that's £300 or £400 million worth of jobs, directly and indirectly, that would see benefit. You would then be able to have the foundations in the job security that you could issue the next 20 years of the CalMac small vessels replacement programme to Ferguson's, to auxiliary yards that you expand across the Clyde. And before you know it, you're supporting 1,000 jobs. As we have it, the Scottish Government has a shipyard in name only because it stops it getting any new work. It stops it then developing and redeveloping the manufacturing class of the Clyde, which again is important towards independence because we're going to have a navy when we're post-independence. So yards like Ferguson's need to be able to work with yards like Govan and Yarrows. But the reality is, and I don't want to be negative and make this into a criticism of Nicola Sturgeon, we only announced 2 stupid ferries that would be so-called green so that Nicola Sturgeon could make an announcement at an SNP conference. Jim McCall didn't even know the cost of the ferries when Nicola announced that she had done a deal with him. And ever since then, we've been chasing our tail, just trying to cover the back catalogue so that Nicola keeps her hands clean. The reality is they were never fit for purpose. They should have just been deemed as a failed procurement. The Scottish Government should have put the blame where it lay, CMAL and Nicola Sturgeon, and we should have just got on with building normal ferries like the rest of the world does. I'm still confident there is a bright future for Ferguson's, but the yard will close by the end of this year if the Scottish Government does not award it the small vessel replacement programme. ALBA Party, Ash Regan, Kenny McCaskill, they have both campaigned for this issue. We're on the side of the workers of the yard. We want to see investment in that yard, not just so that they have jobs and not just so that my community continues to benefit from having a shipyard, but so that people that live in the island communities that need those ferries can benefit from those ferries. And my final point is, Mike, CMAL, they went to great fanfare to announce how well the Turkish shipyard was doing building the vessels. They're consistently delayed after delayed after delayed. We haven't received those ferries yet. Who knows when we'll receive them. Glen Sannox, thankfully, is out there now, so I'm not going to talk that down. I hope it gets itself into action soon, and I hope the workers at Ferguson's get the work they deserve. If Alex Salmond was still the First Minister of Scotland, I guarantee you that shipyard would now have something like 1,000 workers working at it. It's now only got about 70 people from my community working on it. That's a lesson of failed procurement, and that's a lesson of a Scottish Government that spent far too much time with its eyes on peripheral issues that do not matter to people instead of keeping its eye on the prize.
Right. Thank you, Chris. The next question is one on energy. Alex Salmond famously said that Scotland had won the energy lottery not once, but twice. First with oil and gas, and secondly with renewables, and that Scotland had the potential to become the Saudi Arabia of renewables. And yet we've seen very few jobs to come to Scotland on the back of the renewables industry. And retail fuel prices are amongst and electricity prices are amongst the highest in the developed world. What can we do to ensure that Scotland benefits much better from its energy resources, and to tackle the issue of high retail fuel prices and the accompanying fuel poverty? Ask Chris, it's your turn to go first on that question.
Well, the reality when it comes to Scotland's energy is that private capital gets the profits, Westminster gets the revenues, and Scots pick up the price. Now, we live in a country that is practically self-sufficient in generating renewable electricity. We have an overabundance of natural reserves of oil and gas. So it's obscene then that we pay some of the highest energy costs in Europe. One of the benefits of having this green renewable revolution isn't just about giving Scots cheaper electricity. It allows you to attract the energy intensive companies of the future to Scotland, because they know if they come here, they can get very, very cheap subsidised energy. And that's something that then will create jobs, good jobs, good manufacturing jobs, the sort of jobs we need to replace jobs in the North Sea as we move towards a just transition. The reality is now that both the Scottish and the UK governments are only focused on a transition. There's nothing just about it. There's nothing just that shutting down the North Sea, putting 100,000 people, their families, all out of work with no jobs to go to. That's why the renewables energy has to be at the heart of, you create those jobs and you allow people to transition, whether it's from Grangemouth from the North Sea to them. You don't put the people onto the scrap people onto the dole and then think we need to create jobs for them. And the way that you get energy prices down for consumers is you create a national energy company. That's ALBA policy. Nicola Sturgeon announced that at an SNP conference in 2017. She says the Scottish Government would create a public energy company. Subsequently, they've said they don't have the powers to do it under devolution. Ironically or awkwardly, the Welsh Government has created a public energy company, so it can be done, albeit that Welsh company doesn't really have the hefty power. So if we had the powers, whether they were devolved to us or if we were independent, you would set up a public energy company. You would then take a stake of, say, 5 to 10% from every single new off-field extraction license that you grant. You would take a 5 to 10% share in every new renewable field that you grant, and you would use the revenues that that creates to create a subsidy scheme for Scots so that we get cheaper electricity and cheaper gas. We must be one of the only countries in the world that you look out your window if you're in the northeast of Scotland and you see that free energy is coming on shore, but your energy bills are going up. No one else in the world would tolerate it. We shouldn't tolerate it. Scotland's energy should be there for the benefit of the Scottish people, and with independence, we can make sure that happens.
Thank you, Chris. And Neil, would you like to give us your thoughts on the subject of energy?
Yeah, so I was up in Iceland for a trip last year, and the place that we were staying at, the woman who rented it out to us said, if you get too hot in the flat, just open the window to let it cool down. And you contrast that with where we are, where we have, the similar situation, a huge natural energy resource, just like Iceland, but where the Icelandics get their energy pretty much free of charge. And, that many of them now drive electric vehicles as a consequence because it's very, very cheap to charge their vehicles. It's very cheap to heat their home. They don't worry about putting on a coat to stay warm in the winter. And it's much colder up there for a consistent period of time than it is here. But the priorities in the UK are not really about looking after fuel-poor Scots. The priority is extracting the resources. And, I've referred to this as the Great Robbery many times. I cast my mind back to 1976 when the Forties pipeline was first switched on to great fanfare, as if this was some marvellous occasion. The only thing that it was marvellous for was Margaret Thatcher and the coffers in Her Majesty's Treasury at that time. And it has been the same ever since. And the point that Alec was making when he talked about not repeating that gross error where our vast energy wealth was stolen from under our noses relates to the new renewable boom. And we already know that the plans are afoot from the Westminster government to rob us yet again. The National Grid's Beyond 2030 strategy is exactly that. So there are subsea cables east and west of Scotland going down to where the energy is required in England. There is a new pylon going down the east coast and central borders, taking Scottish energy to England. So they are, if you consider Scotland a Westminster asset, they are sweating their asset. They are taking our energy for free, and they give us absolutely nothing back. No jobs, no revenue, and no benefit to our people, apart from a few minor tokens to community councils and the like. But what is the Scottish Government doing to maximise the energy wealth that we have? Well, unfortunately, precious little either. They're not defending oil and gas. They're not making the best out of the
Scotland.
I know, but that's sorry, I forgot the word I'm looking for. But Scotland, exactly the bid for Scotland. So when they had the auction for Scotland, they had it inverted. So they had a ceiling. You could only bid up to a certain amount. You couldn't exceed that. That is perverse. Scotland is worth 350 billion over a 25-year license of 15 billion a year into Scotland. And it is absolutely outrageous that the Scottish government did not protect that. The other issue is Grangemouth. Of course, there has been precious little action from the Scottish government to defend the closure of Grangemouth, and Alec was able to defend the closure of Grangemouth twice. We've got to take some responsibility for the loss of our energy resources being taken out of Scotland. But make no mistake, the UK Treasury sees Scotland as its asset, and they will continue to exploit it. The one good thing from the Beyond 2030 National Grid programme is that we know where the subsea cables are. We know they start in Scotland. And my plan would be on independence that we put meters at the top of those subsea pylons and subsea cables and pylons, and we charge the English for the energy that they take from Scotland going forward.
Thank you, Neil. Now, last question before we move on to closing statements now is one about drug deaths. It's no secret that Scotland is the drug death capital of the UK, and it's the highest drug death statistics of pretty much any developed country. What are your views on that issue of drug deaths? How they can be prevented? How we can tackle that whole issue, and what we ought to do about it? Neil, if you take it away on that.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of the conversation about drug deaths is focused on that endpoint, and understandably so, because a loss of life is a loss of life, and it impacts the family significantly. It's never ever easy. It's never acceptable, and it's obviously very difficult. But the reality is that the pathway to being either a drug or other substance misuser, whether it's alcohol or whatever kind of substance you're using, that there's a pathway to that decision. No one wakens up in the morning and goes, I'm going to start taking drugs just because for the hell of it. The social conditions that drive people to try and control the pain that they feel, and that pain can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be a whole range of things, is driven by the circumstances in which they live and whether they thrive or not. And a lot of it's down to opportunity and a sense of having a future. And if you live in poverty and deprivation, where there's little opportunity on the horizon for good jobs, employment, or education, or you're brought up in grinding poverty and perhaps you've not had the best chances in life, then lots of people do unfortunately turn to the misuse of drugs. So there's a fundamental responsibility to go back to that core driver, the engine room of despair, and that is poverty, deprivation, opportunity. And the only real way that you can tackle that is by reversing that economic hardship of so many people. And you need to have independence to do that. Now, in the short term, obviously, you've got to deal with that symptom, the consequences of drug misuse. And so there are a range of different initiatives that have been started up, but we've got to be careful. When you say safe drug consumption rooms, I mean, that's only one tiny slice of a comprehensive policy that is required. You can't just put in a single intervention and then hope that that's going to fix the problem. You need to have a look at the whole system, from the drivers and causes of deprivation and hardship that lead to drug misuse, but also many of the steps along the way. And so we need a comprehensive strategy for drug deaths, but it has to be bigger than minor quick fixes like consumption rooms. One of the easiest wins that we could use now would be to have safe drug testing. So access to free, safe drug testing so that people can take the substance that they're going to consume and make sure that they know exactly what it is that they're putting into their bodies. And that would be an incredibly efficient way at harm reduction. It's an issue that I've spoken to many of the drug charity workers in my constituency and local area, that they think that is such a quick solution to make sure that people don't overdose or take the wrong substance and then lead to those dreadful consequences. But we need investment, and there's a need to invest, particularly in rehab beds. You can't expect people to come off drugs if they are continually caught up in the criminal justice system and they're not getting access to the proper health support that they need. Because drug misuse, and I go back to that point about poverty deprivation, drug misuse is a symptom of public health policy. So you need to treat it as a public health issue. And that means that we need to think very carefully about the criminal liability on users, and not necessarily people who supply, but certainly on users. We need to take them out of the criminal justice system, put them into the health system, provide proper support and care packages. But absolutely, if we really want to make a difference, we must have an economic policy that addresses the fundamental structural problems that exist under Westminster rule that drive poverty and deprivation. And independence is absolutely necessary to make that a reality.
Thank you, Neil. And Chris, would you like to address this issue of drug deaths?
Yeah, I think every single drug death in Scotland is a tragedy, and I fear that it's just the latest example of a professional class with no lived experience whatsoever trying to export what it sees as the solutions onto people in Scotland. It's the same as the economy, when governments make economic decisions based on what academic economists tell them, who have never actually lived or dealt with the situation. And I think Scotland's drug deaths is exactly the same. 36%, so over a third of drug deaths last year were from street benzo, dodgy Valium, basically. And the Scottish Government's response to that is to, herald safe consumption rooms as the way that will reduce Scotland's drug deaths. The vast majority are from an issue that's not about making it easier for people to inject heroin into their bodies. And it's, I don't support safe consumption rooms as this great panacea. It's akin to Scotland saying we used to have a knife epidemic, so we'll just encourage people to, use their knives in a hospital A&E because it's closer to the point that we can make an intervention. I just think it's pretty absurd that we're effectively saying to a massive part of a young generation of Scots that, the solution for you is just for us to make it easier for you to come and inject deadly substances into your body. So, I'm really worried that the direction of travel from the Scottish Government seems to be that success will be quantified on the more people that we get in the door of the safe consumption room, the better it's doing. Well, no, that just means that you're helping making it easier for more people to inject heroin into their systems. You have said that you're not going to prosecute those people, so most likely you're going to go soft on the people selling them heroin within the proximity of the drug consumption rooms. So for me, that's a worry. And of course, the Scottish Government have completely taken its eye off the ball when it comes to the epidemic of cocaine abuse in Scotland. That really is going to cause an absolute tsunami of young men over the next 15 to 20 years with cardiac issues, mental health issues, and we don't seem to be doing anything to address that. You don't see any public health campaigns whatsoever advising people, as Neil says, about the purity of the substances that you're taking. I used to be aghast when I would see on social media during the COVID vaccine, people saying, I'm not taking that because you don't know what's in it. And many of those people are recreational drug users that have got no clue whatsoever what's in the substances that are taken. But drug deaths, like many of Scotland's socio-economic issues, go back to inequality. We have to, tackle all of the interconnected issues, whether it's, poor mental health at a young age, poverty, deprivation, a lack of educational opportunity, a lack of employment opportunities. All of these things are interconnected, and they lead to, the degradation of those communities. And we just think it's the norm to accept that drug abuse happens. I don't agree with that. I think that we should continue to be firm on drugs. I don't think people want to see drug consumption rooms opening up in their communities. My fear is that, you may well go into your chemist and you see someone get methadone and they've been doing that for 20 years. My fear is that, you know, someone that accesses a drug consumption room tomorrow will continue to access it for the next 15 or 20 years, and quite simply, they will not be offered the help that they should be getting. But the key point is every single drug death is a tragedy. This is something that the ball, as Nicola Sturgeon says, was well and truly dropped on. The main reason being they cut the funding to drug and alcohol partnerships. So that's key. We must invest in drug and alcohol partnerships because they are driven by local outcomes and improvements in their communities. They know better than a Scottish or a UK government on what their local communities need to help each individual have a pathway to recovery. And I think that investment is what ALBA have to continue to support.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We're now moving to closing statements. We've got 2 minutes, a 2-minute time limit on the closing statements or thereby. Chris, would you like to take us away first with your closing statement?
I done the opening statement first. I don't know if maybe Neil.
So you would prefer Neil? Are you okay with that?
I don't mind either way. Either way, guys.
Okay.
Happy to go ahead.
Away then,
Yep.
Neil?
Okay, so I mean, we have a very important job to do in the ALBA Party. We have to take Alec's dream and make it become a reality. And, you know, regardless of what anybody says, we know that we are the custodians of independence, whilst others are prepared to give up on the ambitions of 2014, whether that's nuclear weapons or prioritising independence. Those are things that we will never let go. And so as the custodians of independence, we have a responsibility to do everything we possibly can to deliver ALBA Party MSPs into Holyrood in 2026. That has to be achieved, not just for us as a party and our survival, but for the cause of independence. Because without ALBA Party MSPs in Holyrood, independence will be not probably just on the back burner, but be out of reach for a very long time. So ALBA Party MSPs are absolutely essential in how we connect our messaging with supporters of the party, voters across the political spectrum and other issues, but most importantly, how we reinvigorate those who believed in independence in 2014 to believe in the ALBA Party in 2026. That's the challenge. We need to get ready for that campaign. We need to have the right policies in place. We need to make the right arguments, but we need to invigorate the membership and the wider independence movement to believe that ALBA on the list is absolutely essential and for independence.
Thank you, Neil.
Okay.
Chris?
Thank you, Mike. Alec was victim to the greatest ever political scandal and conspiracy in Scottish political history. What people did to him, I think it's now commonly accepted that, you know, they will see the light of day soon. But that's not why ALBA Party was created. Alec created ALBA because he genuinely believed there was a need for a pro-independence party to hold the SNP's feet to the fire on independence to ensure the Scottish Parliament took bold action when it came to independence. We've spoke about many issues tonight: housing, energy, the economy, putting money back in people's pockets. Many of these things, the power still resides in Westminster, not within the Scottish Parliament. That is why Scottish independence is an immediate priority. ALBA's job is to connect the socio-economic argument for independence to the constitutional imperative of why we need it now. And the only way we will ensure a pro-independence majority at the next Scottish Parliament elections is with a strong list vote for ALBA to elect 15 to 20 MSPs. Yes, to make sure the SNP take action on independence, but also to work with them to face down the Westminster government as we ensure that the people of Scotland have their right to self-determination heard. That's a compelling case I think we can take to people across this country. It's one that I would be honoured to do so as Deputy Leader. That's why I'm in this contest. But whatever happens, I am confident the future of ALBA Party will very much help determine the future of Scotland as an independent country.
Thank you, Chris. So that brings us to the end of the hustings. I'd like to thank both candidates for such comprehensive answers to the various questions. I think we've had a very interesting discussion with lots of food for thought for our members. And lastly, I'd like to thank the unsung heroes, the small team of people who work at HQ to make sure that hustings like this go ahead and all the various activities that are attendant and running a political party like ALBA. These people work at times around the clock with complete dedication, and I think I have to go on record now and thank them profoundly for the work that they do. So that's it. Thank you very much again to both candidates, and we'll now close.
Thank you.